The room was prepared for a careful royal discussion, not a declaration capable of reopening one of the monarchy's deepest emotional wounds. Yet when Princess Sophie finally spoke, there was no hesitation in her voice. She drew a line between Diana's legacy and Camilla's position that nobody present could misunderstand. Within seconds, an ordinary private gathering had become something far more dangerous, a moment that threatened loyalties, reputations, and the fragile peace inside the royal family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie held her ground as King Charles, Queen Camilla, and Prince William absorbed the statement. The gathering had begun as a discussion of legacy, public memory, and how history should remember women shaping the modern monarchy. Royal rank meant formal position within the family, but Sophie's argument cut beyond titles. She insisted that no crown, marriage, or official status could erase Diana's unique place in public and family memory. Camilla did not interrupt. She kept her face controlled, but the calm tightened into something colder as Sophie made the boundary unmistakable. She would never take Diana's rightful place in history. The queen consort understood the wound inside those words. This was not merely praise for a woman long gone. It was a judgment about legacy, and it placed her outside a story she had spent years trying to survive. Charles turned toward Sophie, restrained disbelief visible in the silence. The king knew why the statement struck so deeply. His present marriage stood beside the memory of his former wife, and for a moment, the balance between private loyalty and public history seemed impossible to maintain. Sophie saw his discomfort, yet she did not soften. She had chosen them deliberately. William remained still. He did not defend Camilla, challenge Sophie, or rescue his father from the silence. The prince lowered his eyes for seconds, and that refusal to speak carried its own force. Diana was not simply a historical figure to him. She was his mother, and Sophie's declaration had touched a place no royal discussion could make ordinary. Camilla pushed her chair backward and asked Sophie whether she understood what she had just said. Sophie met her gaze and answered with certainty. She understood completely. The shock was not that she refused to withdraw it. The shock was that this confrontation had been building for weeks, after an earlier incident involving Diana's legacy changed Sophie's attitude toward the question. And to understand why Sophie was willing to risk Camilla's anger and Charles's disappointment, we first have to understand what Diana means to each person sitting inside that room. For Sophie, Camilla, and the memory of Diana, history has never existed only in books. It lives inside marriages, photographs, family traditions, public expectations, and conversations that become uncomfortable the moment one name is spoken. Sophie's declaration carried such force because everyone understood what was truly at stake. This was not merely a disagreement over titles. It was a confrontation over memory and whether holding the crown could ever grant someone ownership of the emotional place occupied by another woman. Sophie understood why Diana's name could still change the temperature of a room. She had watched the monarchy carry that memory for years, sometimes carefully, sometimes awkwardly, but never completely escaping it. Diana remained William's mother, one of the defining royal figures of the late 20th century, and a woman whose relationship with the crown still stirred powerful emotions decades later. Sophie also understood royal duty, the public responsibilities and expectations placed on senior family members, and she knew how much private pain could hide behind controlled appearances. Camilla heard something different in Sophie's words. She heard a rejection of years spent standing beside Charles through hostility, suspicion, and relentless public judgment. The queen consort believed she had paid heavily for the position she now held, enduring criticism while trying to prove loyalty to both her husband and the institution. Yet Sophie's argument suggested that one part of royal history would remain closed to her forever. Camilla could hold the title. She could share the king's life. But she could not inherit an emotional legacy simply because time had moved forward. Camilla later sat alone with Charles and asked the question that had been haunting her since the gathering ended. Did he believe Sophie had spoken only for herself? The king did not answer immediately. He paused, searching for words, and that hesitation wounded her more deeply than anger might have done. She looked at him again, waiting. Charles finally said that memory was complicated, but the damage had already been done. Camilla understood what his silence had implied. Sophie noticed something equally important. William had never asked her to withdraw the statement. The prince had remained quiet, but his silence did not feel neutral. She understood that Diana's memory was not abstract to him. It was tied to childhood, loss, and a mother whose place could never be reduced to royal protocol. Sophie also made one point unmistakably clear. She was not attacking Camilla's marriage, nor questioning her title. Her argument was narrower, but far more painful. Some places in history are created by emotional memory, not institutional rank, and Sophie had reached that conclusion after one Windsor incident she could no longer forget. Because Sophie had not always intended to speak this openly, one private Windsor ceremony changed that, and afterwards silence became far harder for her to justify. Weeks before Sophie's statement shook the family, a smaller incident unfolded almost unnoticed inside Windsor. There were no raised voices, no dramatic walkout, and no confrontation powerful enough to attract immediate attention. But Sophie saw something that disturbed her deeply. It lasted only minutes. A discussion about how Diana should be represented during a private family remembrance suddenly shifted in tone, and one suggestion connected to Camilla made Sophie realize that the battle over royal memory had moved much closer than anyone admitted. Sophie entered the meeting expecting routine family planning, nothing more. The private remembrance was a closed commemoration for deceased members of the royal family, intended to honor them through photographs, seating choices, spoken tributes, and long-established traditions. She expected careful decisions and quiet respect. Instead, she began sensing something far more uncomfortable beneath the polite language. William was there as Diana's son, and the prince listened closely, as every detail concerning his mother was discussed. William became uneasy when the conversation turned from remembrance to presentation. He chose his words carefully, explaining that Diana should be remembered as herself, not absorbed into a larger institutional story that softened the difficult parts of history. The future king did not raise his voice, but Sophie could hear the frustration beneath his restraint. She watched him struggle to protect something deeply personal, while everyone else treated it like a matter of wording. Sophie felt her own patience tighten. She understood that palace presentation, the careful way the monarchy frames people, events, and traditions for public understanding, could sometimes protect the institution from unnecessary conflict. But this felt different. William was not discussing an abstract royal figure. He was defending his mother's place in memory, and the trusted confidant could see how much effort it took for him to remain composed. Then the suggestion came. A senior aide proposed wording that would present Diana and Camilla as two successive women who had helped shape Charles's royal life. Sophie objected immediately. She argued that placing them together in that way blurred two completely different legacies and risked turning Diana's remembrance into a comparison she had never asked for. William said nothing at first, but his expression confirmed that the concern had struck exactly where she feared. Sophie remained behind after the meeting, while William paused beside the closed conference room door. The prince finally spoke quietly. His mother, he said, should never have to compete for her own place in memory. She carried that sentence with her long after they separated, because it transformed the issue from palace wording into something painfully human. So when Camilla finally challenged Sophie directly, the princess was no longer reacting to a single conversation. She was answering weeks of pressure that had been building toward one unavoidable confrontation. Camilla waited until the others had begun leaving before confronting Sophie. What followed was not a ceremonial exchange between two senior royal women. It was personal. Hurt had replaced protocol, and neither woman could hide what was truly driving the argument. Camilla wanted to know why Sophie had chosen language that seemed designed to place a permanent ceiling over her legacy. Sophie's answer was devastating, precisely because she did not shout, retreat, or apologize. She simply refused to change her position. Camilla asked Sophie to remain behind, and the room changed the moment the larger family audience disappeared. The queen consort no longer had to protect herself behind formal smiles or carefully chosen phrases. Sophie stayed. She knew the argument had moved beyond titles, but she also understood that Camilla was Charles's wife and queen, the formal position held by the monarch's spouse. None of that, she said, required Diana's place in history to be reduced, blended, or quietly reassigned. Camilla stepped closer and asked the question she had clearly been carrying for years. "Do you believe there will always be a part of this family that refuses to accept me?" Sophie paused. She did not answer quickly, because she understood how deeply the words could cut. Then she said, "Acceptance and replacement were entirely different things." The trusted confidant insisted that Camilla could be respected for who she was, without inheriting the emotional place Diana had created through a completely different life and story. Camilla felt the anger drain into something far more vulnerable. She admitted that living beside Diana's memory had sometimes made every act of service feel like a comparison she could never win. The Queen spoke of years spent supporting Charles, carrying out duties, absorbing criticism, and still sensing that she was being measured against someone who could never answer back. Sophie listened, and for a moment, the confrontation softened. But she did not retreat. Sophie finally explained what had changed her. The Windsor Remembrance discussion had disturbed her, because Diana's legacy had begun to sound like something palace planners could reorganize for convenience. She told Camilla that when memory became a matter of arrangement rather than truth, someone had to draw a boundary. The Queen understood immediately that Sophie's declaration had not been impulsive. It had been building for weeks. Charles entered before either woman could continue. The king heard enough to recognize that the disagreement had become dangerous, yet he did not immediately defend Camilla. Instead, he asked both women to stop before the dispute spread across the family. But the question was already loose, and silence could no longer contain it. The confrontation had exposed the wound, but the next battle would determine something even larger: whether royal authority could shape memory, or whether memory had already become stronger than the institution itself. King Charles has authority over ceremonies, appointments, residences, and the machinery surrounding the crown. But Sophie's statement placed him against something no monarch can command: collective memory. Inside a private meeting the following morning, Charles faces an impossible contradiction. Defending Camilla too forcefully risks appearing to diminish Diana. Remaining silent leaves his wife exposed. And sitting across from him is William, whose connection to Diana turns what might have been palace strategy into an intensely personal family reckoning. Charles called William and Sophie together because the dispute could no longer be treated as a passing disagreement. The king wanted to know whether a formal response was necessary, or whether silence would prevent the issue from growing. A formal royal response means an official statement issued through the monarchy to define its position publicly. Yet Charles understood the trap immediately. Camilla's position as queen was institutionally secure, but Sophie had challenged something entirely different: emotional legacy, the part of history created by memory rather than authority. Charles placed a prepared note in front of him and read the opening sentence. Then he stopped. The king turned it face down. The language defended Camilla, but it also risked making Diana sound like a problem that needed to be managed. He knew how quickly that could deepen the wound. William watched his father abandon the statement, and the prince understood exactly why. A public defense might protect one woman while appearing to reduce another. William finally told Charles what had been sitting beneath the entire argument. Protecting Diana's memory, he said, was not an attack on Camilla. The future king spoke calmly, but his meaning was unmistakable. His mother could be honored without humiliating the queen, and the queen could be respected without rewriting his mother's place. Charles heard the distinction. What troubled him was that his past and present still seemed impossible to separate. Sophie remained equally firm when Charles gave her a chance to retract the statement privately. She refused. The trusted confidant said she would not allow her words to become an insult against Camilla, but she would not pretend she had spoken without conviction. Charles studied her carefully and realized that forcing an apology might only make the fracture worse. Charles finally decided against demanding one. The king chose silence over confrontation, hoping restraint would contain the damage. But Camilla heard something very different when she learned of the decision. To the queen, it meant that even her husband would not force Sophie to retreat. Anger cooled into something harder. For Camilla, Charles's decision was not neutrality. It felt like abandonment, and within hours the emotional fallout began reshaping every interaction around her. The most painful consequences did not arrive through a proclamation or public rebuke. They appeared in silence. Camilla entered the next family engagement, knowing that everyone present had heard what Sophie said, and knowing Charles had chosen not to demand a retraction. For years, she had learned how to endure hostile headlines and public comparison. But this was different. This judgment had come from inside the family, from someone whose words could not easily be dismissed as outside criticism. Camilla understood immediately that nothing formal had changed. She remained queen, continued her duties, and still held the constitutional position of the monarch's wife. That distinction mattered because this crisis was not about legal rank or ceremony. It was about emotional standing inside the family, something no title could protect. Charles knew that too, and the king watched her closely as relatives gathered again under the same strained silence. Camilla noticed Sophie speaking quietly with William before the engagement began. She stopped several steps away. The queen watched them for a moment, long enough to feel the distance between herself and the conversation, then changed direction without approaching. Sophie saw the movement and understood what it meant. William noticed it as well, and the prince's expression tightened. Nobody had intended the disagreement to become humiliation, yet humiliation was exactly what Camilla now felt. Charles tried to reassure her privately. He told Camilla that her place beside him had not changed, and that one painful argument did not define the family. But the queen answered with a sentence he could not easily dismiss. Reassurance could not erase the fact that nobody had challenged Sophie when the declaration was made. Charles tried to explain the difference between disagreement and silence, but she no longer heard comfort in careful distinctions. Sophie refused to behave as though she had won something. She avoided triumph, avoided whispers, and made no attempt to turn William's silence into an alliance against Camilla. The trusted confidant had wanted a boundary around Diana's identity, not a campaign against the queen. William understood that distinction. He later told Charles that his mother's memory should never be used as a weapon to wound Camilla, but he also refused to see Diana's place softened simply because the present had become uncomfortable. Charles absorbed the words with growing unease. The king finally understood that the family might still escape permanent division, but only if the argument stopped being about victory. Someone would have to speak without advisors, court language, or defensive strategy. And that private conversation finally comes when Sophie and Charles meet alone, stripped of ceremony, and forced to decide whether this family wound can become something other than a permanent war. There are moments when royal titles become useless. Behind a closed door, with no aides, no prepared notes, and no audience, Sophie and Charles finally confront the personal truth underneath the crisis. The king does not ask about palace strategy. He asks something much simpler. Why did she have to say it that way? Sophie's response transforms the argument. She was not trying to defeat Camilla. She believed she was defending something William should never have been forced to defend alone. Charles asked Sophie to meet without secretaries or advisors because he no longer wanted polished language. The king wanted motive, not strategy. Sophie told him the Windsor Remembrance meeting had changed everything for her. She had watched uncomfortable distinctions being softened in the name of institutional harmony, the effort to keep the monarchy united and free from public conflict, and she became convinced that Diana's identity could slowly be blurred if nobody objected. Charles finally allowed the strain to show. He admitted that hearing Diana discussed beside Camilla still pulled him between guilt, loyalty, love, and regret. The monarch spoke less like a king, and more like a husband and father, trapped between two chapters of his own life. Sophie listened without interrupting. She understood that Camilla was not the only person wounded by the comparison. Charles had lived inside that history too. Sophie then told him about William after the remembrance meeting. She had seen the prince's face when the discussion ended, and understood something painful. He felt personally responsible for protecting his mother's memory from becoming something easier for the institution to manage. Charles looked down. For several seconds the king said nothing. Then he admitted that his son should never have been placed in that position, because William's grief should not have become another royal duty. Sophie made the distinction she had been trying to protect from the beginning. Diana having a rightful place did not mean Camilla must have no place at all. The trusted confidant insisted that both women could exist honestly in royal history, but they could not be folded into the same story simply because that version created less discomfort. Charles understood now. Respecting one did not require erasing the other. Charles accepted the principle. The king would not demand an apology for defending Diana's legacy, though he asked Sophie to make certain her position was never turned into deliberate humiliation of Camilla. She agreed. For the first time since the confrontation began, they had found common ground. Inside the room, Charles finally understood Sophie, but outside Windsor, millions were already turning one sentence into a national judgment on Diana, Camilla, and the crown. By morning, Sophie's statement no longer belonged to the family. It belonged to television panels, newspaper editors, royal watchers, and ordinary people who still remember exactly where they were when Diana dominated the world's attention. The debate becomes fierce because Sophie has touched something deeper than royal gossip. Her words force the public to decide whether history belongs to institutions that record it, or to the emotional memory of millions who experienced Diana as something the monarchy itself could never fully define. Sophie watched the reaction spread faster than anyone inside Windsor had expected. Commentators divided almost immediately. Some argued that she had defended Diana's unique legacy against a slow rewriting of royal history. Others accused her of reopening a chapter the monarchy had spent years trying to stabilize. Palace officials chose disciplined silence, meaning no official statement, correction, or public intervention was issued. That restraint mattered, because one formal response could have transformed a private family disagreement into an institutional crisis. Camilla followed the coverage privately, and the old comparisons returned with brutal speed. The Queen had spent years building a public role beside Charles, yet suddenly, every discussion seemed to drag her back into the same emotional triangle she could never escape. Charles stayed close to her, and repeated that refusing to silence Sophie did not mean rejecting his wife. But Camilla heard the headlines, saw the arguments, and understood that reassurance inside the family could not control what millions outside it now believed. Sophie felt no triumph. She understood that Camilla was hurting, and the trusted confidant had never intended to create a public humiliation. Yet she also knew that retreating now would make her original position meaningless. If she apologized for drawing a line around Diana's historical identity, then the entire argument would become nothing more than palace management. Sophie could not accept that. Then one image changed the atmosphere. A London newspaper appeared with side-by-side portraits of Diana and Sophie beneath the enormous headline, "Her place cannot be taken." People stopped outside Kensington Palace, photographed the display, and discussed the message as though it had become something larger than the woman who first said it. Diana's memory had moved beyond the argument. William refused to feed the spectacle. The prince made no public statement, offered no attack on Camilla, and gave the debate nothing new to consume. His silence mattered, because it kept his mother's memory from becoming a weapon against Charles's wife. The country had delivered its emotion. Now the family had to deliver its verdict, not through another explosive declaration, but through the choices they made when the cameras were gone. In the end, nobody loses a title, nobody is expelled from the family, and no ceremonial decree settles the argument. The resolution is more human than that. Sophie's statement forces the royals to acknowledge a distinction they had spent years carefully avoiding. Camilla can possess an honored place in the present without inheriting Diana's place in the past. Once that truth is accepted, the confrontation stops being a battle between two women and becomes a lesson about the limits of royal power itself. Charles makes the position clear in private. Camilla remains his wife, remains queen, and keeps every constitutional and ceremonial responsibility attached to that role. Constitutional standing means the formal position recognized within the monarchy's structure, and Sophie never tried to challenge it. The king understands that this distinction matters because removing rank was never the issue. The argument concerned memory, legacy, and the emotional territory no official title can automatically claim. William also sees the difference more clearly now. Diana's history remains distinct, especially wherever the prince and Harry are concerned, because she was not merely a public figure to them, she was their mother. The family accepts that personal remembrance cannot be rewritten simply to make the present easier. William no longer feels that protecting her legacy requires constant confrontation, and that change quietly removes some of the pressure he had been carrying. Camilla still feels the pain of that conclusion. The queen understands that there is a symbolic place she cannot enter through marriage, service, loyalty, or rank. For years, she had fought to prove that her present deserved respect. Now she realizes that demanding more would only invite the very comparisons that have wounded her most. Sophie approaches Camilla privately after another family gathering. She tells the queen that her statement was never intended to erase her, humiliate her, or deny the life she had built beside Charles. Camilla pauses before answering. Then she admits that she finally understands the difference, even if accepting it remains painful. Sophie does not celebrate the moment. She simply lets the truth stand. Charles finally understands the balance Sophie had been defending. Honoring Diana does not require attacking Camilla, and protecting his wife does not require rewriting the past. The king can hold both truths at once. William quietly accepts the resolution as well, because the boundary around his mother's legacy no longer depends on another painful argument. And with that understanding finally settled, the palace closes the argument where it should have ended all along. Camilla has her place, Diana has hers, and history does not require one woman to replace the other. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.